Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 2 on Social Reformers of the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era led to demands for equal rights by women. Now, by the time we get to 1890, at the beginning of the Progressive Era, the fight for equal rights is not a new story. Women themselves have been openly fighting for equal rights since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. But by the Progressive Era, most states in the Union do not allow married women to divorce. So regardless of the situation, a woman could not go and legally divorce her husband. They also were not allowed to own property. So a woman was not allowed to buy a house. She could not own land. Regardless of whether she was married or single, whatever property she had really belonged to her husband. The really big issue was that women were not allowed to vote. Now, even after Seneca Falls in 1848, women were fighting alongside other abolitionists or people that were trying to make slavery illegal. Slavery becomes illegal in 1865. After that, black men are allowed to vote. Immigrants coming from other countries are allowed to vote. Illiterate men could vote. That means they can't read or write, but they're allowed to pick, who their political officers are. They were even also paid less than men. This is a common thing that we're hearing in society in the 21st century, but it was just as common back then, if not more so. For example, if a man is paid $1, a woman might be paid 60 cents. That's not a historical average, it's just an example. But to give you a better mindset of the wage gap. Women were also expected to remain home. They were wives, they were mothers, and they were expected to embrace traditional gender roles. Even though we see the rise of women being able to gain more jobs in the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age brings about new opportunities for these women through the rise of industrialization. The growth of factories and mass production of things. This gives women a way to get a job, and most women during this time period, or many of them, began to live independently for the first time in these new cities. They weren't allowed to do all of the same jobs as men, but they were allowed to work as secretaries or store clerks or telephone operators. And then, of course, you had your traditional nurses and things of that nature. More girls were beginning to graduate from high school in this era as well, and many went on to attend universities. So women were becoming more and more educated. Whereas before, especially in some high society families, maybe a daughter would be educated through 8th grade, where sons could graduate from high school and go on to universities. It was not uncommon during the Progressive Era for more women to be able to have an education. During the Progressive Era, many women take a lead role in reform or changing society. And here's a picture of just 4 of them. We talked about Jane Addams in Lesson 1 of Unit 2. She's the one who creates the settlement house, where you could go and get a meal or get a bath or even learn English. The next one is Ida Tarbell. We also spoke of her. She's the lady that wrote the book that exposed Rockefeller and his ruthless tactics in creating his Standard Oil monopoly. The WCTU fights for prohibition laws with our lovely Carrie Nation. You can see in the photo with her axe. She's going to go break some bottles. And Florence Kelley, who really brings child labor and women labor issues to the forefront of society and really brings about the idea that children do not need to be working. They need to be going to school. And this is also an era around when we get compulsory education, which means you have to go to school until a certain age. Kids need to be educated as opposed to having to work for their families. The most significant reform for women was the demand for suffrage. Anytime you see the word suffrage, it means voting rights. So, women demanded property and voting rights at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 that I had previously mentioned. And at Seneca Falls, it's not just women. There are men there, and there are African Americans there. But it takes a long time for them to really get these rights. And women become really frustrated after the Civil War in 1865 when black men gained the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment basically grants voting rights to African Americans. But until the 19th Amendment, it's just black men. Women cannot vote, regardless of race. In 1890, we get two very prominent ladies by the name of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This is an organization that is going to fight for women to have equal rights. And this is a very prominent organization that orchestrates several marches, as you can see in the two photos on the bottom right of your screen. These women are peacefully protesting the fact that they are not allowed to vote. Many NAWSA leaders pressured states to let women vote and called for a national suffrage amendment. As you can see in the photo to the right, they're standing outside the White House with signs that say, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? What will you do for women's suffrage?" They're showing these signs to the President of the United States. They're not bashful about it. By the early 1900s, most Western states did begin to allow women to vote. The Western states are often at this time seen as the more progressive or, in a sense, the more liberal states who are open to change. But most women in the traditional East were still not allowed to vote. To put this into a little bit more perspective for my students, June 28, 1919 was the date that Texas ratifies the 19th Amendment, meaning that's when Texas approved women to be able to vote. And we're the first southern state that actually did this in 1919. It's not until 1920 that the actual constitutional amendment was added to the Constitution. And the text of the amendment says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex." So it's very important for you to remember that the 19th Amendment means that women are now allowed to vote. And for those of us in Texas, this means that this year in 2019 was the 100-year anniversary that women had the right to vote in our state. And then next year in 2020 is the year that the nation recognized women's right to vote by passing the 19th Amendment. The Progressive Era also leads to demands for equal rights by African Americans. It's very important to put into context how African Americans are treated in this time period. We're living in an era in the late 1800s, early 1900s that we call the Jim Crow era. This basically means an era of segregation and discrimination based on race, based on the color of your skin. Now, in 1890, when the Progressive Era begins, 80% of African Americans live in the country areas of the South, and most of them are sharecroppers. And the reason that this is occurring is because when African Americans are freed from slavery, they don't have a lot of skills to go out and just get a job, because African Americans were not allowed an education when they were slaves. So a lot of them, the only thing that they know is farming. So they become sharecroppers, meaning they're still working other people's land, but they're getting a share of the money that's produced when they sell the crops. Other issues become literacy tests, which means that in order for an African American man to go and cast his vote, he must first prove that he is smart enough to do so. And these literacy tests were actually tricks. You would have, for example, 30 questions that you would have to complete in 10 minutes. And if you got a single question wrong, you were automatically disqualified as you went. And the questions were really, really ridiculous. For example, one that I have seen was something along the lines of underline the first letter of the second word in this sentence, or something like that. Jim Crow laws also segregate African Americans in all aspects of society. So white kids and black kids can't go to school together. White men and black men cannot work in the same office together. You can't stay in the same hotel, restaurants, trains, other public facilities. Everything is segregated. And this leads to a lot of civil rights cases being brought to the U.S. Supreme Court. The first major case in this line of cases is a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. In this situation, they were trying to show that train car accommodations in the state of Louisiana were not equal for black people and white people. The white cars were much nicer than the black cars. And so there was a gentleman by the name of Homer Plessy, and Mr. Plessy bought a train ticket from New Orleans bound for Covington, Louisiana in 1892. And the reason that he was doing this was there was a law passed in Louisiana in 1890 that said basically that there should be separate rail cars for white and African Americans. And what that stipulated, or what that showed, was that all passenger railways had to provide these separate cars, but each car had to be the same. So the white car had to be the same as the black car. The issue with Homer Plessy, though, is that he described himself as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African American blood. And at that time, he was considered mixed race. So he was considered mixed black and white. And at that point, he would have to ride in the African American car because he was mixed. And so he was arrested because he got on the whites only car. Even though it's said that he was very pale-skinned and he could have passed as white, but because he had that 1/8 African American blood, he was supposed to identify as black. He gets convicted in New Orleans for violating the 1890 law, and he files a petition against the judge claiming that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment states that all people born in the United States are citizens and should have equal protection under the Constitution and equal rights. So this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1896, the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal facilities is constitutional, meaning that it is allowed based on the Constitution, and ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment only apply to political and civil rights like voting and jury duty and things like that, not social rights, which would be considered sitting on whatever car you want on the railway. So 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson says separate but equal is okay. And it takes nearly 60 years for that to be overturned. Another problem in the Jim Crow South is lynching, which we talked about a little bit in lesson 1 of unit 2, which means that somebody would be brutally hanged in most cases for an accused crime and never actually brought to jury about it. So somebody could just be like, oh, you said the wrong thing to my friend over here, and then they would be hanged even though no trial was ever brought to determine whether they were guilty or not. We see a lot of very prominent civil rights leaders that come out of this era, and many of them were very divided on how things should be handled. One of the very prominent ones was a man by the name of Booker T. Washington. This man was born a slave on a Virginia plantation, and he was used to hard work. And he believed that education was going to be the key to African American social equality. He even became a teacher after the Civil War. He founded an organization called the Tuskegee Institute, which is a school to train black workers and teachers on how to do their jobs well. It was all African American, no whites allowed. On race relations, his way of looking at things was accommodation. If African Americans work really hard and educate themselves, that they will earn the rights that they want. So he believed that they needed to work hard in order to gain their own status in society. In one of his very prominent speeches called the Atlanta Compromise in 1895, he says, "Our greatest danger is that the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands, and fail to keep in our mind that we shall prosper as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor. It is the bottom of life we should begin, and not at the top. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." So he's basically saying we need to work our way up from the bottom in order to achieve social equality. The other side of that coin is a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. He believes that civil rights are inherent and that you should not have to work for civil rights and equality. You should just be equal. Now, he was born in Massachusetts. He never experienced slavery. He was the first African American to ever earn a doctorate degree from Harvard. And he opposed Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise. He called for immediate civil rights and the promotion of the talented 10th of young black leaders. In a rebuttal, I guess you could say, to Washington, he says, "We claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free American, political, civil, and social, and until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest and assail the ears of America." So he's basically saying, we were born here. Under the 14th Amendment, we are citizens, Therefore, we believe that we belong here, and we have every right to every single equality that a white man gets. In 1905, Dubois and other black leaders lead the Niagara movement. And this was a movement that demanded an end to segregation and discrimination, as well as economic and educational equality. The meeting ends up leading to the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909, as a means of fighting for black equality. And if you look at the picture on the left of the notes at the top, you can see the people that are coined with the founding of the NAACP. And if you notice, guys, they're not all black. There are some white men on that committee. There are some women on that committee. And it went to show that equality was possible and coexisting was possible. The NAACP fought voting restrictions and segregation laws on the basis of the 14th Amendment to file lawsuits. They were using the amendment's Equal Protection Clause to get people to pass laws that ended segregation and discrimination. Dubois was the most outspoken early member of the NAACP, and he actually wrote a pamphlet called the Crisis Newsletter to call attention to issues in the black community. While women gained voting rights and labor laws, African Americans were unable to end Jim Crow segregation, they could not stop lynching, and they also were unable to gain economic equality. But black leaders in the progressive era inspire later generations like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. to demand change in the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century that does end up leading to much more equality, the end of segregation, and the end to a lot of the discrimination that these people found themselves at the mercy of. That is not to say that in the 21st century we don't still have racism. We, of course, do. We still have issues with civil rights, but it is significantly better now because of these things that these people fought for. That is going to bring us to the end of Unit 2, Lesson 2. See you back here for Lesson 3, and I hope you have a great day.